A few years ago, my wife and I decided to go on a night walk. It wasn't something we usually did, but we were bored, and I've always been more awake at night. I guess you could say I'm like some kind of nocturnal creature. She, on the other hand, isn't as enthusiastic about the night hours, but she humored me. She had a knife tucked into her bag. It made her feel safe. I could tell she was a little jumpy, but it's not like we were going too far out of our neighborhood, so it didn't seem like much of a concern. The night was crisp, the kind of cold where you can feel the chill bite at your skin, but not enough to make you uncomfortable. We didn't have any particular destination in mind. We just wanted to stretch our legs, clear our heads. The path we walked down led us to an old canal trail, one that I knew from my childhood, though I hadn't been there in years. The sound of water trickling under the bridge was calming, but the trees surrounding us were thick, almost suffocating. They made it feel like we were in a secluded, forgotten part of the world. It was a perfect spot to just disappear, to get lost in your thoughts. As we walked, our footsteps crunched softly on the gravel, and I could feel my senses sharpening. The air had that weird, heavy stillness to it, the kind where you feel like something's just a little off, but you can't quite place it. That's when we first saw them. Two people were walking toward us on the trail. They were coming from the direction we were heading, but they weren't moving like normal people. At first, I thought maybe they were drunk or high. They didn't seem to have a clear destination. They weren't walking with purpose, like they were just drifting along. But as they got closer, I realized something wasn't right. They weren't talking normally. It wasn't like they were speaking in another language or whispering. It was more unsettling than that. They were speaking, yes, but their words didn't make any sense. It was like they were trying to have a conversation, but every word seemed disconnected from the others. One would say a word, and the other would reply with something that had no relation to it at all. There was no rhythm to their speech, no sense of flow, just random words thrown together, almost as if they were trying to mimic the sound of a conversation but failing miserably. It sounded almost rehearsed, but with an eerie lack of coherence. I glanced at my wife. Her face had gone pale, and I could feel the tension in her grip on my arm. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she felt it too. The same cold, creeping sense that this wasn't normal. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible, just watching them approach. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some explanation. Maybe it was some kind of weird prank. Maybe they were just lost in their own heads. But no, something about them felt wrong, too coordinated, too deliberate. The way they moved, the way they spoke, it was almost like they were operating on a script, but one that was horribly out of sync. I could feel my heart starting to beat faster, and I slowly motioned for my wife to stop walking. We stood still, just off the path, trying to blend in with the shadows of the trees. I could hear them getting closer, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel, but they didn't seem to notice us. They didn't glance in our direction or acknowledge our presence in any way. They kept walking, their mismatched words spilling out like some kind of strange performance, their faces blank, their eyes not meeting ours. I felt like I was holding my breath for an eternity. When they finally passed us, it was like they weren't even aware of us at all. They just kept going at the same slow pace, like they were on some invisible loop. The air around us felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. I could feel my wife's breath on my neck, shallow and quick, and I had to force myself to relax, to not make any sudden movements. We waited, not daring to speak, until they had moved far enough away. Then, finally, when I was sure they were out of earshot, I let out a long breath. My wife turned to me, her eyes wide and filled with fear. She didn't need to say anything. I could tell she was just as unsettled as I was. We stood there for a moment, both of us frozen, not knowing what to do next. "I think we should go back," she said, her voice quiet, barely above a whisper. I nodded, my own voice thick in my throat. "Yeah, let's go." We didn't say much as we walked back, our footsteps now quick, our senses heightened. Every rustle in the trees, every creak of a branch, made my heart race. We didn't speak, not even a word, as we made our way back down the canal trail, our eyes constantly scanning the shadows. The strange conversation of those two figures seemed to follow us, echoing in my head, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't like someone was following us directly. It was more like we were being watched from somewhere just out of view. When we finally made it back to our car, we didn't even speak right away. We just got in, locked the doors, and drove off in silence. It wasn't until we were a few miles away that my wife spoke. "I don't know what that was," she said, her voice trembling, "but it wasn't normal." I agreed with her, but there was something else gnawing at the back of my mind. Something about the whole encounter didn't add up. It wasn't just the strange speech or the way they moved. It was the way they ignored us completely, as if we weren't even there, like we were invisible to them. It didn't sit right with me, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how completely out of place it all was. In the days that followed, I kept thinking back to that night. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just two people messing around, maybe they were lost, maybe they were sick, but none of those explanations felt right. It didn't help that I kept having these vivid images of their faces, blank and expressionless, walking slowly through the trees without acknowledging us. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. It kept creeping back into my mind, like something that wasn't supposed to be there. Eventually, we stopped walking at night. We found other ways to pass the time, things that didn't leave us with that uncomfortable feeling in our stomachs. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I think back to that night. I think about those two people, and I wonder what the hell they were doing. And I wonder if they're still out there, somewhere, walking along that canal trail, speaking their strange, disconnected words, completely unaware of the world around them. I don't know what it was. I don't know if we'll ever know. But whatever it was, it left me feeling like something was just a little bit off in this world. Like the line between what's normal and what isn't is a lot thinner than we like to think. For as long as I could remember, my friend and I had spent countless hours walking in the woods near his house. The trails were familiar, the trees were comforting, and the air always felt clean. It became part of our routine, something we do almost every day. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a kind of sanctuary for us. The world felt a little less complicated when we walked, and even though we were just a couple of teens, the woods made us feel like we had our own little piece of peace. But there was always something strange about those walks. At first, it was barely noticeable, like a faint echo. Footsteps. We'd hear them alongside us, behind us, even ahead of us, and most unsettling of all, they would follow us no matter where we went. At first, it was easy to brush it off as a trick of the mind. The woods had a way of playing with your senses, right? The crunch of leaves in the distance, the sound of branches snapping. It was easy to convince yourself it was just the wind or animals scurrying about. But after a while, the sound of footsteps grew more distinct. It wasn't like a random crunch or a snap. It was rhythmic, measured, deliberate. The steps matched ours exactly. If I took a step, I could hear it right after. If we stopped, they would stop too. If we started walking again, they'd follow suit. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't outrun it. We could be in the middle of a clearing, a spot where the trees gave way to open space, and we'd still hear them, those footsteps. Always close, always following. The odd thing was that when we tried to look, there was nothing there. No one behind us. No shadows moving in the corner of our eyes. The woods were always empty, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirp of distant birds. But the footsteps, they never stopped. We began to notice it more over time. It became a pattern, Sometimes one of us would stop walking just to test it, and the other would keep going. The footsteps would keep following the person walking, but the one who stood still would hear nothing. As soon as they started walking again, the steps would sink right back with them. It wasn't long before we stopped trying to understand it. We didn't talk much about it anymore because talking about it made it worse, or at least that's what we told ourselves. It was just something we had to accept. The woods were haunted by these footsteps, and that was all we could make of it. But then something happened that made everything feel even more eerie. We had been walking along one of the old roads that cut through the woods, a road we didn't take as often. It wasn't a trail or anything, just an old gravel road that connected some farmhouses further out. We'd started walking it just for a change of scenery, to see the woods from a different angle. The air was cooler, the light had that slightly amber glow it gets just before sunset, and the trees felt heavier in the distance. Felt different than usual. And then, as we were walking, we heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I thought maybe it was just our imaginations running wild, like usual, but this time it was different. The footsteps weren't coming from behind us or beside us. They were coming from ahead, from deep in the woods that lined the side of the road. It was impossible. There was no way anyone else was out here. It was too quiet, too isolated. And yet, the sound kept coming. The same rhythmic footsteps, like someone walking through the underbrush. We stopped dead in our tracks. I couldn't help but look at my friend. He looked just as unsettled as I felt. The footsteps were growing louder. They were coming closer, and yet, when we looked into the woods, we saw nothing. There wasn't anyone walking out there. There wasn't any movement, but the steps kept coming. For a moment, neither of us moved. I think we were both too afraid to even breathe. And then, as if by some bizarre fate, a small bird hopped out from behind a patch of brush. It was tiny, barely more than 4 inches long, and it was hopping along the ground in the leaves, making a soft noise with each step. The bird's little hops matched the pace of the footsteps perfectly. It was a strange sight. The bird was hopping in sync with human footsteps, moving at exactly the same pace as if it were walking in time with a person. The only way I can describe it is like the bird was mimicking a person walking in the woods. It hopped from leaf to leaf, making that crunching noise in time with the steps that had been following us. My friend and I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching it. We both started laughing, the tension easing up in a rush of relief. The noise, the footsteps, the strange feeling we'd been carrying for all these years, it all made sense in that moment. It wasn't something sinister. It wasn't some dark entity following us. It was just a bird, an incredibly tiny bird that hopped at exactly the same rhythm as a person walking. But the weird part was that it didn't make sense. The bird was nowhere near us when we first heard the footsteps. We'd been walking for miles, and this bird didn't belong to our part of the woods. It didn't live in the forest by my house. I'd never seen a bird like that around there. It was almost like the bird had been waiting for us to walk this exact stretch of road, right at this moment, and hop along behind us. It was a bizarre feeling, like we had just solved a mystery we didn't even know we were trying to solve. 2 years of wondering, of worrying about footsteps, and it all came down to a little 4-inch bird with a perfect sense of timing. It didn't live in my woods, but it seemed to make its home in my friend's woods, where we had heard the footsteps for years. After that day, we never heard the footsteps again. It was like the mystery had been solved, and the weight had been lifted. The bird had given us the answer we didn't even know we were looking for. We could go back into the woods without the dread of hearing those steps following us. We could walk with a little less fear, knowing it was just the bird. No dark forces, no spirits, no strange things creeping around us. In a strange way, it was comforting to know that sometimes the scariest things in life can be the smallest and most innocent. The woods, the footsteps, they weren't anything supernatural. They were just part of nature, something simple and small, yet somehow so perplexing that it took us years to figure it out. And when we walked through the woods after that, it felt different. The sounds of nature, the crunching leaves underfoot, they became familiar again, no longer tainted by the constant, unnerving echo of footsteps. I still don't know why that bird was there, why it hopped in such perfect time with our steps, but somehow it didn't matter anymore. We'd found our answer, and that was enough to bring peace back to our walks in the woods. It started as the kind of trip I had been dreaming of for years, a solo adventure deep in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, BWCA. I was eager for the solitude, the quiet, and the challenge. The idea of being completely alone in the wild, relying only on myself, had always been an appealing thought. I had done my research, planned every detail, and even went over my gear several times. My canoe was ready, packed with everything I'd need to survive for several days in the wilderness. I entered the BWCA early in the morning, launching from a secluded spot where the water was still, reflecting the clear blue sky. The air was fresh, and the trees around me stood tall and silent, creating a natural cathedral of sorts. It was the perfect beginning to what I had expected would be a perfect trip. I paddled on, a sense of excitement filling me, the kind you get when you're stepping into the unknown. For the first day, everything went smoothly. I paddled across the glassy waters, went through a couple of portages, and set up camp on a small, isolated lake. I didn't see anyone else all day, and that was exactly what I wanted. I made my dinner. Nothing fancy, just freeze-dried meals and some jerky, and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the cooling night air. As the evening settled in, I crawled into my tent, ready to sleep under the stars. But that's when things started to feel a little off. At first, I brushed it off as the usual sounds of the wilderness, the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustle of a breeze through the trees. But as the night deepened, I began to hear something else, a faint sound that I couldn't quite place. It was almost like footsteps, soft, cautious, rhythmic. At first, I thought it might just be a squirrel or a small animal rummaging through the leaves nearby. But the sound was too deliberate, too steady. I froze in my sleeping bag, straining my ears. The noise continued, closer this time. Mice were common out here, I knew that, but these sounded bigger. I was no stranger to the wilderness. I had spent plenty of time camping, hunting, and hiking in places like this. But something about that night felt different. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and groan. Shadows seemed to dance in the moonlight, and the forest felt less like a comforting presence and more like an eerie, unknowable force. Eventually, the sound stopped. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably nothing more than a deer or some other animal. I tried to relax, but sleep was elusive. The wind howled outside, pushing the branches against my tent as if it wanted to tear through. I kept hearing the rustle of the leaves, the snap of twigs, and that occasional footstep-like noise. It was as though the forest was watching me, waiting for something. When I woke up the next morning, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been a product of a restless mind. But as I unzipped the door of my tent and stepped outside, something caught my eye. 3 arrows had been driven deep into the ground, lined up in a perfect row. They pointed directly toward the lake. I stared at the arrows for a long time. The first thought that crossed my mind was that they were some kind of marker, but who would leave arrows like that? And why point them toward the lake? There was no way it was a coincidence. I knew there were no other campers in the area, at least not for miles, and I hadn't seen any signs of other people around my camp. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. A chill ran down my spine. I quickly packed up my gear, moving faster than I ever had. The thought of staying there for even another hour felt unbearable. I didn't bother making breakfast. I simply grabbed my things, shoved them into my canoe, and paddled away from that camp as fast as I could. The wind had picked up, and the water was choppy, making paddling more difficult than I anticipated. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I passed through 3 portages that day, and while I saw a few other people along the way, none of them seemed to have any idea what was going on. The whole day felt like I was rushing through it, not wanting to stop and look back. I paddled a total of 14 miles that day, rough, tiring miles, and by the time I set up camp on another lake, I was exhausted. I felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering unease that I couldn't shake. That night, I ate a quick meal, hardly enjoying it, and went to bed early. My body was sore, and my mind was still racing from the morning's events. I tried to push everything out of my head and focus on getting some rest. But in the middle of the night, I woke up again. At first, it was just the usual nighttime sounds. The wind, the creaking of branches, the rustling of small animals. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving outside my tent. Not just a mouse or a small animal, but something bigger, something deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I lay perfectly still, trying not to breathe too loudly. My heart was pounding in my chest. The wind was howling outside, but through it, I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate. They were moving around my campsite, circling my tent. It was as though someone was out there, watching me, trying to get closer. I tried to tell myself it was just my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of arrows being driven into the ground, the same as before. It was faint at first, but then I heard it clearly. 3 arrows driven deep into the earth, right outside my tent, pointing toward the lake. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my gear, packed up as quickly as I could, and pushed my canoe back into the water. The wind was still howling, and the water was rougher than before. My arms were sore, but I didn't care. I paddled hard, ignoring the aches in my muscles and the exhaustion weighing on me. I needed to get out of there, and I needed to do it now. I made it to the outfitter by mid-afternoon, my heart still racing. I hadn't seen anyone or heard anything else, but the feeling that something was wrong never left me. When I finally made it to the outfitter's base, I was a mess. Tired, jittery, and completely on edge. The outfitter could tell something was off, but I didn't say anything. I just wanted to get home, away from the wilderness. That was my last solo trip into the BWCA. I've been back since, but always with a group. I'll never do another solo trip again. Not after what happened. I try to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a coincidence, that the arrows were some weird prank or something. But deep down, I know it wasn't. The feeling I had that night, being watched, being hunted, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. Looking back on it now, it almost feels fake, like something out of a horror movie. But it wasn't. It happened. And for the first time in my life, I was truly terrified of the wilderness I thought I knew so well. It was a Saturday morning when my brother, our friend Tom, and I decided to take a hike in the woods. We had grown tired of the usual routine of staying in on weekends, scrolling through our phones, or binge-watching shows. We wanted to be active, get some fresh air, and explore somewhere new. The area we chose was known for being deep in the woods, far from roads or even other hikers. The kind of place where you might walk for hours without seeing another person. The trail we were following had been mapped out, or so we thought. But the deeper we went into the woods, the more it felt like the forest itself was taking us somewhere else. We weren't entirely lost, but it sure felt like we were venturing into the unknown. We spent the first hour enjoying the peace and quiet, the soft crunch of the leaves beneath our boots, the occasional call of a bird, and the feeling of isolation. It wasn't like we'd never hiked before. My brother and I had grown up in a town where nature was just a few steps away. But this felt different. The woods seemed endless, like they stretched on forever. The sunlight began to fade as we ventured further, but none of us were really concerned. It wasn't late, and we had a headlamp and flashlights just in case. Still, there was a growing sense of unease in the air. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there. Then we saw it. At first, we thought it was a trick of the light, but as we approached, the shape became clearer. A house, or at least what used to be a house. There was something strange about it. The beams of wood were exposed, drywall was scattered in the yard, and there were splintered pieces of furniture everywhere. It didn't look like any normal house we had seen in the woods. It was clearly newer construction, but the damage to it looked like something out of a natural disaster. Tornado, maybe? There were no signs of any trees uprooted nearby. No debris scattered around the property like you'd expect if something had torn through the area. It was as if the house had been the only thing affected. None of us said anything at first. We were all just staring at it, trying to make sense of it. Tom, who had always been the curious one, was the first to speak up. "Let's go check it out." The thought of exploring a house like this was unsettling, but at the same time, it was too intriguing to ignore. The three of us slowly approached the front door, which hung loosely on its hinges. The house was eerily silent. No sounds of animals or wind, just dead air. Inside, it looked like something had torn through, but the strange part was how everything inside seemed random. A single chair was overturned, and shards of glass littered the floor, but the walls had been ripped open, exposing the skeleton of the house. It wasn't a gentle collapse. It was almost as if something had violently ripped through the place. We moved carefully, checking for any signs of danger. The floor creaked beneath our feet, but there was no immediate sign of anything threatening. In the corner of what used to be a kitchen, I spotted something odd. Toaster. It wasn't smashed or broken, just sitting there in the middle of the mess. It was the strangest thing. Why was a toaster the only object left untouched in the wreckage? We took a few more minutes to look around, poking through some debris and carefully stepping around the mess. Everything inside seemed out of place. The house was built fairly recently, at least from what I could tell. The construction materials seemed newer, and it wasn't some old, abandoned shack. It was a house that had been lived in not long ago, but nothing made sense. The house was in the middle of nowhere, and we couldn't figure out how anyone would have built it there, or why it was so destroyed. After a while, we decided to leave. It was too weird, too unsettling, and none of us were brave enough to stay any longer. We retraced our steps, figuring we'd come back another day to explore more. But as we walked back, something was gnawing at me. It wasn't just the house that bothered me. It was everything else about that place. It didn't feel right. As we neared where we thought the trail should have been, we realized something. We were disoriented. We should have come across familiar landmarks by now. The trees didn't look the same, the path didn't feel right. We must have strayed further than we thought. But after a few minutes of backtracking, we found our bearings again. The hike back to the car was straightforward, but the house was already slipping out of our minds. That was until we tried to find it again. We came back the next weekend, determined to locate that house again. We figured it wouldn't be too hard. It was only a mile or so from where we had stopped before, but we couldn't find it. No matter where we looked, no matter how far we wandered through the woods, there was no sign of it. We combed through the area we thought it had been in, covering a much larger area than we initially thought. It didn't make sense. We had seen it with our own eyes, so how could it just disappear? We even went back a third time and then a fourth. Each time we'd start from the same point and walk in the same direction, but the house was nowhere to be found. There were no new houses or abandoned structures, no signs of destruction, nothing. It was as if the house had been swallowed by the forest. The oddest part wasn't that the house was gone. It was that the area around it seemed perfectly fine. There were no signs of a storm, no broken trees, no odd patterns in the ground where it should have been. It was like the house had simply vanished, but everything around it remained untouched. After weeks of searching, we gave up on finding the house again. But I couldn't let it go. There was something wrong about the whole experience, something I couldn't shake. I had no answers. I didn't know what happened to that house or how it had gotten there in the first place. I didn't know why it had been so destroyed or why it seemed to vanish without a trace. All I knew was that there was a place out there in the woods that defied all logic, and it still haunted me every time I thought about it. We never went back to the woods again, not to search for the house, not to hike. We all just agreed that some things are better left unexplored. We never spoke of it much after that, but I think we all felt the same thing, the need to move on. The woods were too quiet, too empty, and there was something about that house, or whatever it had been, that just didn't fit. And to this day, no matter how many times I walk through the woods near that spot, I still can't find that house. It's like it was never there at all. I can't help but wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if my mind had played tricks on me in those woods. But something deep inside me tells me it was real. The house, the destruction, the toaster, it all happened. I just don't know why. The woods remain silent, as if holding their secrets close, and I'm left with the strange, unsettling memory of a house that shouldn't have been, in a place that shouldn't have existed. It was a warm evening, typical for late spring, but something about the air felt off. The kind of air that made your skin prickle like someone or something was watching you. But that's probably just the reputation of Belanglo State Forest weighing on my mind. I'd been warned about the place since I was a kid. Every time I saw the news, I'd hear about the backpacker murders. 6 bodies found, all left to rot in the woods in the same spot at the same time years ago. Some say it's the sort of place you never want to visit alone. It's strange, though, how that eerie reputation fades when you're with 1,000 other people. The sounds of the scout camp, the chatter, the laughter, all drowned out the dread. Even the kids, despite their innocence, would joke about killers lurking in the trees, giggling and making fun of the dark history as though it was just a silly story. But for someone who had been to this forest multiple times, I knew there was something unsettling about this place that didn't quite sit right with me. It wasn't the kind of forest you'd find peace in. It was too quiet, too thick. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something unplaceable. The trees were so tightly packed that you could barely see through them. At night, when the lights dimmed and everyone went back to their tents, it felt like the forest itself was waiting, watching. Around 9 p.m., after the evening activities, a queue formed at the toilets near the main camp. It wasn't a huge line, but it was enough to get impatient, and I decided I'd rather find somewhere else to relieve myself than stand there any longer. I slipped away into the trees, making sure to stay close to the path so I wouldn't get lost. The last thing I needed was to wander too far, especially with the way everyone talked about the forest. But there was something about the night that made the dark stretch out longer than it should. It was like the trees swallowed up any light, and the shadows grew impossibly deep. I didn't realize how far I'd gone until I glanced around and saw that the campfire lights were distant now. They felt like tiny dots behind me, flickering in the vastness of the forest. I could barely hear the voices of the other campers. It was only then that I felt a flicker of unease, that feeling of being alone with the trees closing in around me. I squatted down behind a large bush to do my business. The ground was soft, moist, like the dirt had been dampened by rain or the dense canopy above. I glanced down for a moment, just to make sure I wasn't stepping on anything sharp. That's when I saw it. The ground wasn't just dirt or twigs. Scattered around me, half hidden by moss and ferns, were small bones. At first, I thought they were just twigs. The kind that break off from a branch, the ones that look vaguely like bones if you don't pay close attention. But these weren't twigs. They were bones, real ones. Some were small, almost delicate, while others were larger, unmistakably animal in shape. I froze. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I couldn't pull myself away. I wasn't sure if it was shock or the sudden surge of adrenaline, but I couldn't move. My mind was racing. It was only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. I stared at the bones scattered across the forest floor, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. It wasn't like the bones had just been dropped there. They looked old, worn down by time, but still distinct. Some were bleached white, others had patches of dirt and rot clinging to them, as if they'd been exposed to the elements for far too long. The bones didn't look fresh, but their presence was unnatural, especially out here, so far from the path, surrounded by nothing but trees and shadows. It wasn't just the bones that were disturbing. It was the realization that I was in the middle of nowhere. There was no one around, no one to hear me if something went wrong. The rest of the camp felt like a distant memory now. My body was frozen, tense, every sense sharpened as I scanned the area around me. The wind was still, and the silence had taken on a strange weight. I couldn't even hear the usual rustling of wildlife. It was like the entire forest had decided to hold its breath. I needed to leave. I had to get back to camp. But as soon as I stood up, I heard it, the faintest sound. So soft I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. A snap, like a twig breaking underfoot, far off in the distance. But in the quiet of the woods, it might as well have been right next to me. My heart skipped. I stayed perfectly still, waiting for the sound to repeat, but it didn't. It was gone. Maybe it was just a bird or a small animal, but something about it didn't sit right. I looked around again. Nothing moved. I stepped back, slowly at first, trying not to make a sound. But then I felt it, the feeling of eyes on me, the same feeling I had when I first stepped into this part of the forest. It wasn't paranoia. It was something else, a primal instinct that told me to run. But where? Which direction? How far had I gone? The trees were so thick around me, and the camp was so far away now. I had no clear way of knowing if I was still near the path or lost in the woods. The queue at the toilets felt like a distant memory, a long-forgotten moment. I forced myself to take a step back, then another, until the ground under my feet felt less like something to fear and more like the place I needed to get back to. I moved cautiously, trying not to step on the bones again, feeling my way through the forest, pushing past the dense undergrowth. The further I walked, the more I realized how quiet everything was. The usual sounds of insects, birds, and the wind in the trees were absent. It felt like the whole forest had gone mute, like nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. My senses were on high alert, and my mind kept racing, asking questions I didn't want the answers to. Why were the bones there? Was it just animals? Had something else been there before? A shiver ran down my spine as the thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't just animals? What if the bones had been left by something or someone else? But I quickly shook the thought away, trying to rationalize it. There was no one out here. There couldn't be. The scout camp was 1,000 strong, but the nagging feeling of being watched never left. As I pushed my way through the brush, I finally saw a break in the trees ahead, the clearing where the campfire light flickered weakly through the branches. I moved faster now, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the earth beneath me. When I finally broke through the trees and back into the light of the camp, I felt a flood of relief, but it didn't last long. My mind kept replaying what I had seen, the bones, the eerie silence. I wanted to shake it off, to tell myself it was just animals. It had to be, but I couldn't. I didn't tell anyone about what I found, at least not then. There was no way I could explain what had happened without sounding like I'd gone mad. I pushed it out of my mind as best I could, but it followed me through the night, that nagging feeling. The next day, I made sure to stick closer to the group. I never wandered far again. I didn't return to that part of the forest. Felt wrong. And for weeks after the camp, I couldn't stop thinking about those bones. The silence, the feeling of eyes on me. Even now, years later, when I drive past Belanglo, I feel it. That same unease. Something about the place just doesn't sit right with me. And I'm not sure I'll ever truly know what I found out there. In the woods, under the cover of darkness. But I know one thing for sure. Some places are better left unexplored. Some things should stay buried in the past. It was one of those lazy afternoons that only come in the middle of summer. The heat felt like a blanket over everything, stifling and heavy, but there was still work to be done. The farm was quiet, too quiet, except for the occasional hum of the old tractor or the distant sound of a bird's wings flapping. My dad and I had been walking along the fence line for hours, fixing the wire that had become tangled over the winter. We had walked the same stretch of fence so many times over the years that it almost felt like part of the landscape itself. The wind was barely there, barely moving the leaves or even ruffling the hairs on the back of my neck. I could feel the dry dust sticking to my boots, the heat from the sun seeping into my skin, and the smell of freshly cut grass in the air. We were about halfway through the task when I noticed it, a large shadow above us, barely moving. I didn't say anything at first, thinking it was just another bird. But when I glanced up, I realized it wasn't just any bird. It was a great horned owl. It sat perfectly still, its sharp eyes fixed on us from a branch barely 12 feet above our heads. I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something unsettling about the way it just sat there, watching us. Its feathers were a dull brown with the characteristic tufts on its head, and its beak looked almost too sharp. It had this eerie presence, like it was aware of every move we made. Its large yellow eyes locked onto mine, and for a second, I couldn't tear my gaze away. I blinked, and when I looked back, it was still there, perched silently. Dad didn't seem to notice at first, but I could see him glancing up at the trees now and then, sensing something was off. The owl didn't make a sound, not a single hoot, just those eyes, unblinking, watching. I turned back to the fence, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, but I couldn't shake it. Every time I adjusted the wire or hammered a nail into the post, I would glance up at it. It was still there, only it had shifted slightly, its head tilted in a way that made it look even more menacing. I tried to focus on the work, but I could feel the owl following us. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of it moving to a new branch just above us. No matter where we went, it was always directly overhead, always staying a few feet ahead of us, always watching. The only sounds were the occasional creaks of the fence and the occasional soft rustle of the owl's wings as it shifted position. We kept walking along the fence, making our repairs, but the air around us felt charged, like something wasn't quite right. Every step felt deliberate, like we were being led into something. I glanced up again, and there it was, sitting in a tree above us, just as still and silent as before. It felt as if the owl were guiding us, making sure we stayed in its path. It wasn't until about 30 minutes later, when we had finished fixing the last part of the fence, that I felt the strange weight lift from my shoulders. I figured we had probably just disturbed its territory, and it was waiting for us to leave. We started walking back towards the truck, the woods opening up in front of us. But then I saw it. Right in our path, perched on a low branch, was a baby owl. It was small, no bigger than a football, and its feathers were still fluffy and soft-looking, far less intimidating than the adult that had been following us. It just sat there, staring at us with wide, curious eyes. I froze for a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up again. I didn't say anything, but I could feel Dad's presence next to me, sensing the same unease. We didn't move, just stood there, eyeing the baby owl. The adult was still perched somewhere nearby, but it had shifted. I couldn't see it for a second, but I could feel its presence. It was watching us, just like it had before, and I had the odd feeling that it was waiting for us to make our next move. Then, without warning, the adult owl swooped down from its perch and landed softly next to the baby. It wasn't like it was just coming to check on it. No, this was different. The way the adult landed next to the chick, the way it curled its wings and nestled close to the baby, made it clear the owl wasn't going to let us get any closer. It was almost like a protective gesture, a silent warning, as if the owl was saying, "Don't come any closer." My heart started pounding, my legs frozen in place. I glanced at my dad, and I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. He didn't say a word, but the look on his face told me everything. It was time to go. We slowly backed away, not wanting to make any sudden moves. The owl didn't move at all, just stayed there, huddled next to its chick, its eyes still fixed on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that the owl wasn't just protecting its young, but that it had been watching us this whole time, guiding us, making sure we didn't get too close. There was something about the whole experience that didn't feel natural, like we were intruding on something far bigger than ourselves. We turned around and walked slowly, carefully, not wanting to provoke the owl or disturb the fragile peace that seemed to hang in the air. As we made our way out of the woods, the trees seemed to close in behind us, as though the forest itself was watching us go. I didn't look back, not once, but I could feel the eyes of the owl on me, still following us, even though we were leaving. When we reached the truck, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I didn't know what to make of the experience. Was it just a coincidence? Had we just happened to walk into the owl's territory? Or was there something more to it, something that I couldn't explain? As I got into the truck and slammed the door shut, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed paths with something wild, something that wasn't just a bird, but a force of nature, protecting its young and watching over the land. I glanced over at my dad, and he was already starting the truck, his eyes still on the woods, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. It was one of those moments that sticks with you, that leaves you questioning things that don't quite fit. We drove away in silence, the strange weight of the experience still heavy in the air. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the owl. There was something about it, its eyes, the way it moved, the way it followed us, that felt so much more intentional than anything I had ever experienced before. I don't know if we were meant to see it or if it was just a freak encounter. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but feel like the woods had shared something with us. Something old and wise, something we couldn't fully understand. It was one of the craziest, but coolest experiences I've ever had. I don't think I'll ever look at owls the same way again. I grew up living on the outskirts of a small town in rural Arkansas. We weren't far from town, but far enough to where there wasn't much to do except for wander off into the woods or spend time with a few friends who lived in scattered houses out in the country. One of those friends lived a few miles down the road, and the quickest way to get to his house was by walking along the train tracks. This was a path I knew well, too well probably. It felt like second nature to walk those tracks at night, just as much a part of the town as anything else. But I was wrong about one thing. I had never really thought about how dark it gets out there. Not the kind of dark you get in town with streetlights fighting against the shadows. No, this was something else entirely. This was the kind of dark that feels like it might swallow you whole. A thick, oppressive blackness that seems to reach out and pull at you from all directions. There's no moon, and the stars are blocked out by the heavy canopy of trees. The woods around me were dense, quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the far-off screech of a night bird. That night, I decided to head over to my buddy's house. It wasn't anything special, just a regular trip, but when I started walking along those tracks, something felt off. It was one of those gut feelings that you don't want to admit to, but it's there, gnawing at the back of your mind. I wasn't exactly scared of the woods. I'd walked those tracks 100 times before without any problems, but tonight was different. It was the middle of the night, and the world felt more alive in a way I couldn't explain. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It felt alive, like something was waiting, watching, listening. As I walked, the gravel crunched beneath my boots, each step sharp and loud in the still night. I kept my eyes forward, trying to focus on the distant lights of my buddy's house, knowing it was still a ways off. But then, just as I thought I had settled into the rhythm of the walk, I heard something, a crashing sound coming from the woods to my left. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the usual rustling of small animals, like squirrels or birds. No, this was something bigger, heavier. It didn't sound like anything I had ever heard before. I stopped dead in my tracks, holding my breath, trying to listen. The noise stopped abruptly, like whatever it was had heard me too. I waited for a moment, then took a slow step forward, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Another step, then another crash, this time closer. My pulse quickened. I stopped again, straining to hear through the thick darkness. Whatever it was close now. The rustling of the underbrush was louder, closer, and moving at a fast pace. It was almost like whatever was out there was tracking me, pacing me step for step. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I thought about turning around, heading back, but something inside me, the stubborn part, the part that didn't want to seem scared, kept me rooted to the spot. Besides, I had to keep going. My friend's house wasn't that far away. I started walking again, slowly this time, each step careful, as though I were trying not to disturb whatever was lurking in the woods. But the crunching in the woods didn't stop. It followed me. I could hear it darting through the brush, just off to my left, too close for comfort. It wasn't just an animal anymore. It wasn't a deer or a rabbit. This was something moving deliberately, as though it had purpose, and that made everything feel wrong. I kept walking, even though every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn and run. The sound grew louder. Then, out of nowhere, it rushed through the brush right in front of me, so close I could almost feel the wind from its movement. My heart slammed in my chest. I froze, not knowing what to do. The gravel beneath my boots crunched, a harsh sound that felt deafening in the stillness of the night. Then, everything went quiet again. I held my breath, listening for any sound, any movement. My eyes strained against the dark, hoping to catch even the slightest glimpse of whatever was out there. Then I heard it again, a loud, wet snort, almost like a deep, labored breath. The sound sent a chill through my entire body. The noise was so close now, I could almost feel the heat of whatever was there. It was no deer. It wasn't a bear. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of what was happening. The snort was followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing off into the woods again, its footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, barely able to move. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen, too terrified to move, to breathe. But when I finally found the strength to take a step forward, I did so as quietly as I could. I didn't run, couldn't run, not then. Instead, I kept walking, faster now, but trying to keep my steps light, hoping against hope that whatever it was wouldn't follow. The last thing I wanted was to turn around and see something, anything, lurking in the darkness. The rest of the walk felt like it took hours, though in reality, it was probably only another 20 minutes or so. But I was on high alert the entire time, every sense tingling, every step a calculated risk. My buddy's house finally came into view, a small light in the distance that I couldn't have been more grateful to see. When I finally reached the door, I knocked quickly, almost frantically, and when he opened it, I practically shoved past him, not even thinking to say hello. Inside, I turned on every light I could find, kitchen, living room, the hallway, all of them. I sat down at the table, my heart still thudding in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling of something out there in the dark, watching me, tracking me. For the next hour or so, we sat there, talking about nothing in particular. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop looking out the windows, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. I wanted to ask my friend if he had ever heard anything like that before, but I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I kept thinking about that crash through the brush, that wet snort, and how close it had been. The sound had been so loud, too loud for anything normal. I knew it hadn't been a deer, couldn't have been. Eventually, I started to calm down. The lights, the company, the warmth of the house, it helped. But the nagging feeling didn't go away. I kept wondering if I'd been close to something I couldn't explain. I thought about it long after I went home, staring out my window into the night, trying to make sense of it. But the thing was, I didn't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. Some things you're better off not understanding. It wasn't until later that I realized what had happened. The next day, I heard from a few people in town that hunters had been seeing a large boar in the area. A wild boar, full-grown and aggressive. They'd been chasing it off for weeks, but nobody had ever gotten close enough to get a good look at it, and no one had ever made it far enough out into the woods at night to have an encounter like mine. It wasn't until I heard that, after the fear had worn off, that I realized what I'd been dealing with. The sound, the size, the way it moved so quickly and silently. It all made sense now. A wild boar in those woods, this far from town, could have been more dangerous than I realized. But the strangest part? I still don't know if it was the boar that was tracking me, or if it was something else entirely. Something darker, something I don't want to think about. And I never walked those tracks alone again. Not at night. Never. This Halloween night, and we're all sitting around a fire, half of us roasting marshmallows, the other half glued to our phones. The crisp air cuts through our jackets, and the light from the fire flickers, casting shadows across our faces. There's an undercurrent of nervous energy. Something about Halloween brings out the weird stories, especially when the darkness outside feels as thick as the stories we're hearing. My friend Rachel, usually the quiet one, speaks up. Her voice carries the weight of something darker than usual, something heavier in the air. She shifts uncomfortably, looking at us, her expression tight. We stop talking, all eyes on her. "I have a story," she says, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of her jacket. "But it's about my parents." I raise an eyebrow, intrigued. I've never heard Rachel talk about her family like this. She's not the type to get sentimental or share family stories. So when she mentions something like this, we all listen. "I don't like telling this one," she continues, glancing down into the flames, as if unsure whether she should go on. "But it's true. You all probably won't believe me, though. It's about their first date." We all laugh, some of us teasing her lightly. "Come on, Rachel. It can't be that bad." She sighs, still looking at the fire, her face a mask of something unspoken. "You don't know the whole story. I didn't until I asked them about it. But it's not just a story. It's real." The crackle of the fire is all I can hear for a moment, and the air feels heavier now. Rachel stares into the flames, her voice quieter when she starts again, as if the weight of the past is pressing down on her. "My mom and dad met in college. You know how it goes, that awkward first date vibe. But they made it through dinner, and then my dad suggested they go for a hike. Not your usual, dinner and a movie kind of date. But my dad was an outdoors guy. He was into rock climbing, so he knew Provo Canyon like the back of his hand. I lean in, intrigued. The mention of Provo Canyon rings a bell. I've been there a few times, hiking, biking, exploring with friends. It's peaceful, quiet, the kind of place where you can easily get lost in thought. But if I'm honest, there's always been something a little eerie about it. The steep cliffs, the thick trees that block out the sky in places, the overwhelming silence that sometimes presses in around you. Rachel continues, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of unease. They drove up to the mouth of the canyon just before midnight. It was a new moon, so the sky was pitch black, no light from the stars. You could barely see your own hand in front of you. I can almost picture it, driving up the winding road with the only sound being the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the tires against the asphalt. The closer they got to the canyon, the more isolated the road would have felt. The air would have been cool, carrying that scent of damp earth and pine needles, the kind of smell that hits you the moment you step out of the car. My mind paints the scene, the dark shadows of trees lining the road, the feeling of being cut off from the rest of the world. They got out of the car and started walking along the trail, just the two of them walking into the canyon in the dark. At first, it was just a normal hike. No weird vibes. But as they kept going, my dad started feeling this unease, like something was wrong, like he was being watched. Rachel pauses, her eyes focused on the fire, like she's reliving it. Her fingers twitch. He tried to ignore it, convince himself it was nothing, but it kept getting stronger, this sense of wrongness. They reached this point where the trail dipped under a thick cluster of trees. It was so dark, even the moonlight couldn't get through the canopy. My dad was used to the dark, but something about it felt wrong. I'm starting to get the sense that this isn't your typical spooky story. Rachel's not playing it up for laughs or drama. This feels real. And then the next part comes, and it makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My dad kept going, even though he could feel something was off. And then he stepped on something soft, right in the middle of the trail. He couldn't see it, too dark. But he knew it wasn't just a pile of leaves. He could feel it under his foot. That's when the bad feeling hit again, stronger than ever. My mom, she said later that she felt it too. At the same time, Rachel's eyes meet mine now, her gaze intense. They didn't stick around to find out what it was. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both knew something wasn't right. They turned around and hightailed it out of there. I swallow hard, and the air feels colder now, like something has shifted. I can't help but think about how real this sounds. It's not some campfire ghost story. It's a real memory, something that happened to her parents. I can feel my pulse quicken, just slightly, and I'm fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. Rachel looks at all of us, her eyes still locked on mine. It wasn't until years later, after they were married, that they were watching TV one night. They were watching an interview with Ted Bundy, the serial killer. My dad's watching it, and then they get to this part where Bundy's describing how he got close to being caught. The interviewer asks him about a time when he almost got caught, and Bundy says something that makes my dad freeze. She leans in, her voice low. Bundy says that one night, he'd lured a girl into Provo Canyon. He killed her there, and as he was leaving, he heard people coming up the trail. He hid in the trees just in time. But what he saw next, that's what freaked my dad out. Rachel glances at me, her expression a mix of disbelief and fear. Bundy says he watched some guy walk right into the body, and then that guy just turned around and walked away, like he didn't even notice it. I feel the blood drain from my face. The air around the fire seems to press in on me, heavier than before. I try to shake off the feeling, but it sticks to me like a shadow. I've been to Provo Canyon. I know that trail. I've walked it in the dark before, on hikes with friends. feeling the weight of the silence press down. But hearing Rachel's story, hearing the connection to Bundy, makes everything feel different now. Suddenly, I'm aware of how easily it would have been to miss something in that kind of darkness. How something as simple as stepping over a body could go unnoticed. Rachel doesn't say much else. She just stares into the fire, her eyes distant now, lost in the weight of her parents' experience. We sit in silence, all of us thinking about what we just heard. The fire crackles again, but I can't shake the feeling that something is off. There's a kind of tension in the air, like we're all waiting for something. Waiting for the next step, the next story, the next move. And then, when the night goes quiet, I start to realize something. Maybe it's not just the story that's haunting me. Maybe it's the thought that any one of us could have been in that canyon, that night, and never even known what we walked past. How many people have missed something like that, something real and dark and terrible, just because they didn't look closely enough? We sit there, long after the fire has died down. The chill in the air seems to seep into my bones, and I can't quite shake the feeling that I'll never look at the canyon the same way again.